Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Albert I. Hermalin, who will discuss his latest book, The Well-Being of the Elderly in Asia, a 4-country comparative study. Welcome to Rip Rap, Al.
Thank you, Jim.
This book is a wonderfully complex study of both current and future social change that involves the elderly in Asia and how that change raises concerns about the well-being of the elderly in the societies that have relied so heavily on children for old age support. How did you become involved with this particular topic, and how does it reflect your study of fertility and family planning in Asia, especially Taiwan?
Like many projects, it started with quite a specific question. As you noted, I had worked on fertility and family planning in Asia for quite a long time, actually since about 1968. And by the late 1980s, I observed that the fertility rates in Taiwan and in many countries in East Asia and some countries in Southeast Asia had been declining rapidly, much more rapidly than I and many other observers in the 1970s expected. And one of the questions that started to occur to me is whether the strong family arrangements in Asia and where the older people depend on their children might serve as a brake on this decline. So it really started with a question about the effect of family support on fertility. But as I thought about it, I also then realized that there was a much larger question there, which is what was happening to the older people under these very rapid demographic and socioeconomic transformations, since these countries were modernizing very rapidly, urbanizing, and the like. And so from that small question, we moved into the much broader question of trying to observe what's happening to this important group of people that was growing very rapidly under these changes.
We should mention there were 4 countries.
As I noted, a lot of my work was in Taiwan, but the study itself covers Taiwan, Singapore, Philippines, and Thailand.
Well, I was really impressed. I mean, this is quite a research project. And I was also impressed with the size of the team that you put together. Right. And maybe you could mention some of the people who were involved with it and their affiliations.
In Thailand, we worked with Chulalongkorn University and Navapon Chayavan. In Singapore, we worked with both the Bureau, the Department of Statistics, the Chief Statistician Paul Chung, and with the National University of Singapore. In the Philippines, we worked with the University of the Philippines and their quite famous Population Institute. And then in Taiwan, our long-term collaborators were the Institute of Family Planning, a government agency, plus collaborators and here, like John Odell and John Castelline, who were colleagues of mine.
Well, it contains an impressive amount of demographic research, I must say.
Yeah. Well, what we did is, perhaps one thing to keep in mind is that as we entered this field, the field itself was very new. Population aging was kind of a new branch within population studies because the phenomenon of populations aging rapidly was just starting to occur, certainly just starting to occur in Asia, although it had been going on for a while in Europe. So we were all, feeling our way and trying to develop a program for moving ahead. It's worth noting perhaps that the National Academy of Sciences book on the demography of aging, which started to codify this field, didn't come out till 1994. So it was a very new field for many of us. And the way we organized it was to try to move quite logically in the following way. We first thought it would be important to round up the available data, the censuses, the vital statistics, some of the preliminary studies. Those 3 other countries we mentioned in Southeast Asia, the Philippines and Singapore and Thailand, had done some preliminary research under an ASEAN project back in the mid-'80s. So we had some initial data. And so our first thought was to take a broad, to take stock of the situation. And that occupied us for the first couple of years. The second thing we did was to conduct many focus group sessions among all 4 countries, interviewing both the older people and younger adults, those in the urban areas, those in the rural areas, less educated, more educated, to get a feel of what were people experiencing, what did they think about the changes that are going on. Was this impinging on their ability to take care of their parents? Did the parents feel that they were being taken care of? And those 2 sets of things, and plus the preliminary data that I alluded to, then helped inform the major surveys that we undertook mainly in the mid-1990s in all 4 countries. So we've tried to build quite systematically in that way. And then we launched these very large surveys, nationally representative, that covered many facets of the status of the elderly, which was, where were they living, what kind of support were they getting, what was their economic status, how was their health, what were they doing, were they working or not, were they seeing their children frequently if they weren't living with them, and so it was a very long and complex survey that we eventually worked out. Our goal from the beginning was to get to know the status of these older people, how were they doing, and to get to know them comparatively so that we could compare one country to another to see what made it perhaps work better in one country, less well in another.
Well, throughout, you pay quite a lot of attention to the methodology of it, and you also point out as you did that you were looking into other disciplines
Right.
by the virtue of what you were doing.
Right. Well, it was quite challenging. One of the things that struck me, as I said, the demography of aging, narrowly defined, is relatively new, but gerontology is a very old enterprise. I think the word was first used around the 1900, if I recollect the history of it. And of course, it involves public health programs. Of course, there's the biology of aging. There's the provision of programs for older people. So there are many facets to gerontology, and we had to both learn what was relevant for us, intersect with the epidemiologists who asked about health and learn some of that aspect of it, and learn something about the program and delivery of services. And so, it was very educational in that respect.
Well, it seemed as though for some of these topics you also had to adjust the configuration of your methodology in order to come up with the results that you wanted.
Well, we had to, you always make, in a couple of senses, yes. In one sense, whenever you do a survey, as you know, you never have enough time and you never can ask everything you want. So very often there were existing scales and measures that we had to adapt and make them work in each country and make sure that we had enough time for them. So yes, there was a lot of learning and adapting and fitting, right.
One of the things I thought was interesting, and maybe you can put this all in the project into context, is how you and your colleagues organize the research into the pertinent policies and demographics. Yeah,
what occurred to us early on, we learned early on, and something that surprised me, is that the policymakers in Asia were quite foresighted in seeing these trends emerge. I was, as you noted at the beginning, working on fertility and family planning, but a number of them, by the early 80s, were sensing that things were changing and they had to pay attention to it. And it's a real compliment to them in that sense. And so one of the things that we learned, and we tried to make very clear in the book, devoting a whole chapter to it, is that there were policies and programs devoted to the elderly going quite a ways back, that this was recognized. And one of the motivating forces, one of the precipitating forces that set a lot of this in motion was the United Nations World Assembly the first Assembly on Aging, which the UN convened in Vienna in 1982. And although it was mainly oriented to what was happening in Europe, where there had been, quite a rapid aging of the population because of the low birth rates, the Asians took it very seriously, and they started to do things. And I can trace some early surveys to 83, 84, and the like. So yes, there was so that put us on that gave us the clue that we have to pay good attention to what the policymakers were doing and how they were reacting to the situation. They have a very interesting challenge in Asia. You got the feeling that what the policymakers wanted to do was to, they were asking in effect, can we modernize, and continue our social and economic development, but not necessarily westernize in the sense of having everybody be individual, away, living alone. They wanted to preserve the family's arrangements to a large extent. They saw this as beneficial for the society and for the individuals involved, but they knew that they had to supplement that with appropriate programs, health programs, pension programs, service programs. So they were fashioning a kind of new ground, that they were innovating quite a bit of ground, and that's one of the things that I find fascinating about the whole Asian situation, is this new approach of trying to protect important features of the old, but not assume that it's going to take care of everything.
Well, there's that concept of the older living with the younger,
Yeah.
Which with the changes in demographics as you explore, may not be possible in the future.
That's right. And that's why the policymakers, I think, are planning ahead. They have instigated what amounts to Social Security type programs in almost all the countries. Some of them are further along than others. They do have health insurance plans for their both the current workers and the older people in many countries. So they are not relying on a very strict or simple continuation of old arrangements. One of the other things you mentioned, the demographics that we did in the planning. One of the things that demographers like to do and can do is to do what we call, technically cohort studies. We can, in certain respects, although we're not better in forecasting than anybody else, but certain ways you can look ahead. For example, people who are 30 to 40 years old have generally all completed their education. So we can look at today's 30 to 40 year olds and look at them 30 years hence and say, 30 years hence, the people who are 60 to 70 will look like this in terms of their education. And they're going to look very different than the current older people, because the countries have greatly increased their educational opportunities over the years. So again, the policymakers have this neat problem. They have to serve the current elderly, but they have to realize that the next generation of elderly are going to look very different. They're going to be more educated, more professional, more urban, with different preferences, and as you noted, may want to live alone, and not because they don't like their children, because they have these more modern ideas of what they want. So yes, things will change quite rapidly because of just that factor alone, those demographics.
It seemed pretty clear that the possibilities of rather large changes and transformations could happen both in the elderly and those who might be expected to help take care of them.
That's right.
There's all these things happening.
That's right. It's all moving along.
Yeah, it's like on two different trajectories almost.
That's right. Well, and that's one of the causes of tension. One of the, to go back to that education example, one of the problems now is that the current elderly did not have opportunities for as much education. So you have an older parent, let's say, whose son and daughter-in-law, to take an example, are both professionals, dual wage earners, out on the town. Well, this calls for a very different kind of relationship than the old traditional, say, Chinese arrangement where the daughter-in-law waited on the mother-in-law and made her favorite food and did all those things. So one of our themes, one of the ways I like to think about it, is that what's taking place is a great deal of accommodation. It's not that the old system is disappearing, but that people have to accommodate. They realize that both the older and younger people realize there are changes around. And so they and some of them can do it more easily and some of them can do it more gracefully, but one of our aims is to capture this accommodation, and it's going to be going on for the next 25, 30 years. And as I think I started the book out by saying, this is a study of social change. What's going to happen to this older group and their relations with the children as the whole society is going through these changes? And to me, it's a fascinating opportunity to see social change in action and to see how the family accommodates and adjusts to these changing conditions. We don't always get a chance to do that.
Well, and the book has an amazing number of slices, or however you want to say that, microscopes or views of this process. including self, assessment and economic and
Right,
cultural
right,
and
right.
a number of ways.
Yeah. What we did is, as I said, to go back to the very broad goal, we wanted to understand this well-being of the elderly. How were they doing? And it seemed to us that the logical components of that, if you say to somebody, are, how well off are they economically? That's always important. What is their health like, both their physical and mental health and their emotional health? And then what are they doing? Are they working? Are they retired? Do they have enough leisure? And so to us, this seemed like the three logical components of well-being. And so we devoted quite a bit of time in each questionnaire to measure these things, and then, of course, as you note, to present them in the volume. Now, that seems straightforward, but in a sense, this was a change and somewhat of departure of what was being done before that. Earlier, there was a tendency to just look at whether people were living with their children, the older people, were they living with their children. And there was an assumption that if you're living with the children, everything is fine. Well, our feeling was maybe not. That is, just to go back to that example of the dual wage earner kids and so on. What we found is that in a lot of families, the older parent or the older mother-in-law is cooking the meals, shopping, and the like, and she's doing a lot, and she may or may not be under duress or under strain. So it was understandable that people wanted to focus on these living arrangements, or whether they were getting a weekly check or something like that. But our view is, as I say in some part of the book, that kind of confused form and function. That is, the form was there, but nobody looked to see whether that meant that everything was going well. Our perspective is we want to see how it's actually working out. Who is doing what within the household? How is money being allocated? Do the parents have enough leisure, and so on? So that was so those three components that we mentioned in terms of economics, health, work, and leisure, we felt were the direct measures of well-being, and we gave them a lot of emphasis.
Well, I thought that made it quite interesting because it was also a perception and a subjective,
right,
reaction to what, you could mark it just in terms of economic status, and that doesn't quite answer
right,
what it is
right,
to
right,
live
yeah,
and have a good life.
Right.
The other thing about the volume is, you talk about this in the preface, is that you made a conscious effort to bring the volume and his work up to date and broadly relevant as possible. Mm-hmm. And I thought, boy, for a project that size, that's quite a goal.
Well, we could do better on some dimensions than others. That is, obviously, we couldn't go out and do a survey the week before we closed the press, but what we could do, to go back to these policies, this is an area of so much flux and so much activity, and nowadays with the internet and the like, we could monitor some of the debates, some of the new programs up to the last minute. I can't remember, but I think I have material that, it touches into 2002, the last debates about the Thai pension program, and so on. So we tried to bring it up to date that way. Another way of the relevance is that we realized that we only had 4 countries, and people, will always say, well, how representative of 4 countries? And we could not go out and do surveys all over Asia. But what we did do is try to put these demographics, as you mentioned, into comparison with other countries in Asia where we can get this demographic data. So if you look at the data in Chapter 2, for example, you'll see us looking at all the countries in Asia, comparing Asia with Europe and the US, and looking at those dynamics. How did Japan compare with data from China? So we tried to show that in what ways were our countries similar and different than some of the other countries that are important and that we wanted to keep track of. Then the last touch, I think, is in the last chapter, where we try to take our findings about the well-being of the elderly and this discussion of policy and the like, and then say, okay, what does this mean now? If you're a policymaker, what should you be thinking about? What might you be doing? How should you be looking at things? And in that way, try to bring it up to date again. So those were the places where we thought we could make it quite up to date.
Well, and I thought that the volume, the project, functions as kind of a seminal work where you're it's starting to get a take on what's happening, with this important topic in Asia. And I don't know the literature, but it seemed to me, from my perspective, it was a major movement forward toward that goal.
Well, thank you. We did try to achieve that in a couple of ways. When we set out the project, the course back in '88, '89, we didn't start out saying, well, we're going to do a book in 5 years or 6 years or something. We put out a lot of research reports and published articles and the like. But it was about 4 or 5 years ago I realized that we probably had more data and more to say than most people did. And at that point I thought, well, we ought to go ahead and we ought to try to put it together in a very coherent way. And our early emphasis on stressing comparative work helped us a great deal. We had similar data, not always exact, but similar data for each country. And if you recall, in each chapter we lay each country side by side. Now that was a change if you pick up other books on aging in Asia and some other places, of which there are a few, and they're very useful. But the original way to do it was you'd pick up a book and have some very good people writing, here's the situation in Singapore, and then another chapter on Thailand, another chapter on Indonesia. Those are all informative, but they didn't necessarily talk about the same thing, so you never could say, well, how does Indonesia stack up on point A with Singapore or with Malaysia or so on, because it wasn't the intent to do that. Our feeling was that by laying the countries side by side, we can say, okay, what's the same, what's different, what does that tell us about some of the things that might be accounting for this, and get some further insight.
Did you notice anything, or when you reflect back on it, that you didn't expect after completing the project as it evolved?
Well, that's there were some surprises. Of different sorts. One of the interesting things, one of the things you learn, and this gets a little specialized, but for example, some surprises in the following things. We often think that the economic level of a country, the economic stage of economic development, would be associated with more independence of the older people and so on, just as we think, well, in the West we've gotten to be pretty high incomes and people have their own things. But it isn't that simple. You take Singapore, which is the wealthiest of all, the highest per capita income of those 4 countries, and they have about the highest percentage of older people living with children. Okay, well, why does that come about? Well, in part it may be preferences, but in part it's the housing structure of Singapore, of the government making these estates available and encouraging this, so that you have as against the general income expectation, you had the ecology of Singapore pushing in a different direction, and then that was a surprise. So that in some ways Singapore is very modern, and in some ways it's as traditional as any of the countries, and maybe more so. Those sorts of surprises were interesting. Yeah.
Well, the one thing that, and we've talked already a little bit about that, is the notion of change is the thread of continuity through all of this. The challenge of defining the demographic dynamics of change in an aging population, and then based on that trying to project the trajectory of those dynamics in the future. But as I reflected on this, and I think as indicated already a little bit in our comments, it's the tempo in these countries, this change is happening much more rapidly than I think most people realize.
Yeah, that's a good point. Change is a very important substrate to everything we're saying. Is I think it has emerged to a certain extent. Let me break it up in a couple of ways. First, let's just look at the demographics. Yes, these populations generally are aging much faster than countries in the West. If I remember my numbers correctly, very often the benchmark for what's getting to be an older population is if you have 14% of your population over 60 or 65. In Thailand, it will take about 21 to 27 years to go from 7% over 60 to 14%. That took 45 years in Spain and the United Kingdom. Took 68 years in the United States. So you can see that they're moving in terms of their demographic profile at a much more rapid rate than we are. Now, does that make a difference? Well, yes, in a number of ways it does, because these countries are moving toward an older population while they're often at a lower level of economic development than the West or the U.S. was when it was going through these things. So they're poorer, and they're starting to face problems that they would be much better off if their economic development was further along. So from that standpoint, there's a very important aspect of the rate of change. But there's two other aspects of change I'd like to point out, and again, that involves both the humanitarian and the developmental aspect. From the humanitarian standpoint, we want to look at changes that occur to individuals as they age. If you think about it, when we talk about aging, we often think about transitions. We go from working to being retired, or sometimes we go from full functioning to some limitations in what we can do. And sometimes we go from living alone to needing some kind of assistance. And so we need to study how are these transitions occurring to the older people, when do they occur, who do they occur to, what are the factors that lead to these transitions. So in one chapter, I think it's chapter 12, we talk about these transitions, and for most of the countries, we do not yet have that data to do a full job, because to do it, you really have to watch the people over time. It isn't to know when people go from living alone to living with their children or assisted living in some way. We have to just follow them. So we need what's called longitudinal studies and the like, and we're starting to do that in Taiwan. We have done that. In the United States, there's a large study that's been doing this, the Health and Retirement Survey, that's been tracking people every 2 to 3 years, excuse me, since 1990. So that's another aspect of change. And then the third dimension of change is back to the developmental. What will these changes in the structure of society in terms of the proportion of older people mean for the labor force, for productivity, and how might the society respond?
Well, what's been interesting is I like to go around and ask people about, a book interview that I've got coming up. And people actually are quite interested in it because it resonated with the idea of elderly in Asia, and people are only too well aware in this country about the elderly
Right.
and what they're facing.
One of the things that always intrigued me in Asia, when you looked at some of my colleagues who were working, we think of working, if you have health insurance, you put your children on as a dependents. They were able to put their parents on as dependents, which was very obvious to them, but for us it would sound odd. But there are ways that things of that sort that in Singapore the children can pay out of their pension fund the medical bills for their parents, and so there's a lot of permeability across these accounts.
Well, thank you for being on Rick.
Well, it's been fun.